So what I'm going to be, I guess, a little bit giving the big picture that Yola's presentation is very much a part of. And what I'm going to be talking about is essentially the undue influence of the pharmaceutical industry on healthcare provision and the medical profession. And I wanted to start by saying that the pharmaceutical industry has a very important role in producing medicines and distributing them, and that social role is very different from the role of providing healthcare, being involved in disease diagnoses, and being involved in educating physicians to make treatment decisions. And the World Health Organization in a 1993 report referred to this as an inherent conflict of interest between the legitimate business interests of manufacturers, or certainly legitimate to produce medicines to make a healthy profit, and the needs of a healthcare system. So basically the need to provide medicines in a rational way. And if nothing else would tell you that there was a problem, the fact that a drug, so an atypical antipsychotic drug, Abilify or aripiprazole, could be the best-selling product in the United States in the fiscal year 2013-2014, with almost $7 billion of sales, tells you that there's something wrong. Something wrong in terms of the overdiagnosis, something wrong in terms of the use of a very powerful antipsychotic for depression as an add-on treatment when antidepressants don't work, which would be expected if you looked at the clinical trial evidence more than, in fact, most of the time. And also in terms of, even within antipsychotics, a choice of this particular expensive on-patent product. So one of the things, one of the differences in terms of the role of the pharmaceutical industry in having an influence on treatment decisions is that companies have a very strong incentive to sell their products while they're still new and on patent. And so you have to ask, is newer better when it comes to medicines? Well, most people looking at this photo and Steve Jobs announcing the new Apple computer would say, well, of course that's better. I guess unless you're a hipster, and most people are not at the right age range, would say a lot better than an Underwood typewriter in terms of doing what you wanted to do. When it comes to medicines, however, companies do not have to show that their medicine is any better than alternative treatments that exist for the same condition when they bring it on market. So this is an overview of the evaluation of almost 1,000 medicines over the period from 2002 to 2011, so a 10-year period, by a group in France, La Revue Prescrire, that evaluates every new medicine that's approved and every new approved use for a medicine. And you'll see that about half are what would be called classic Me Too drugs here. They're top of their scale. I don't know if you can read that as bravo, because they're French, of course. And that's quite a small little stretch. That essentially you're looking at about 7% where there's a clear advantage compared to existing alternatives, and around 15% that were judged to be unacceptable because they were less safe or less effective than drugs that were already on the market for the same condition. So this is an example. But the thing about, I guess the difference between what's needed to get your drug on the market, which to show an effect, versus placebo, or sugar pill, as Yola described it, and actually getting, recouping your investments in research and development, is that you need to establish market share for every new drug. And this is an example of an antidepressant. It just shows you the kind of that's essentially no more effective than alternatives and has some safety concerns not shared with alternatives. So it was in the unacceptable category in that rating system, and but became a bestseller regardless. You see those kinds of emotive messages in terms of selling the drug. And this is
what is the slogan side in that graphic?
Sorry?
What is the slogan side in that graphic?
Okay, it says, depression hurts, Cymbalta can help. Right? So it's a very, it's a very powerful message, actually, in terms of just saying this is a source of hope. Right? But it doesn't tell you that this is the best treatment, either even whether that person necessarily needed drug treatment, or if so, whether they needed this one.
Just make it worse.
Yeah, it could make you worse as well. I mean, this is another example that's a diabetes drug, Avandia rosiglitazone, that has since been withdrawn from the European market and restricted in Australia and in North America. And there you have a message going the distance, and essentially the message is on glycemic control. This drug ended up causing additional heart attacks, and it had never been shown to actually prevent the complications of diabetes. So it's also pushing the treatment decision in a different direction than it might have been in otherwise. So what is driving this? The promotional expenditures are like in terms of the volume of information that physicians and other health professionals get, they greatly outweigh other sources of information. And that's even true in Australia. You actually have a better system than many other countries in terms of information provision. The last very precise, detailed study that looked at the two major market research companies in pharmaceuticals and came up with a most reliable estimate they could come up with of what the expenses actually were, came up with an estimate of around $58 billion United States in 2004 being spent on promotion in the United States. So that's about a quarter of total revenues. And one of the things that they found as well was that about a quarter of those of that spending was on activities such as paying key opinion leaders, so contracts with specialist physicians who are leaders in their fields, ghostwriting, a number of other activities, medical education that are not considered advertising.
Please explain what ghostwriting is.
Ghostwriting is what every student is not supposed to have somebody else do. Ghostwriting would be a situation where a company hires a medical communications firm to actually write the articles that an academic guest author puts their name on. So that academic should be being penalized by their university. They're actually, it's being seen as another publication. And this is, this is just my little, the sort of in terms of the industry being the elephant in the room. It says at the bottom, I'm right there in the room and no one ever acknowledges me. So very present. This is an example of a clinical trial report on an antidepressant, citalopram, S-citalopram, which is almost the same thing as citalopram, but was able to get a new patent. The clinical trial report at the end, it has acknowledgments. It says, acknowledging the people from the actual pharmaceutical company who edited and helped to produce the manuscript. And it's true that there's been a bit of a crackdown on ghostwriting, and now you do have those acknowledgments, but those people should be the first author. This is a quote from a British Medical Journal article on key opinion leaders, and it's also their image. From a pharmaceutical sales representative saying, these were salespeople for us, and we would routinely measure the return on investments by tracking prescriptions before and after their presentations. And if the speaker didn't make the impact that they were expecting, then the company would not invite them back. Now, these are often specialists in their field who do not see themselves as part of the sales force of the company. There's been an enormous increase in the funding of key opinion leaders, and one of the ways they're funded is being part of speakers bureaus, and others is to be on advisory boards. This is just showing you that in 1999 there were 66,000 presentations by key opinion leaders to other physicians in the US. That jumped in 2004 to 237,000. In fact, we've seen a lot less sort of payment to go on lovely trips for us to the Caribbean, and much more payment for consultancies and advisory board and speakers bureaus. Sales representatives and the free samples they provide remain the major spending category in pharmaceutical prevention and promotion. And this is just a classic signing for the free samples in front of the rather messy sample cabinet in this case. I carried out a study along with colleagues in which we enrolled over 255 doctors in 4 cities in Canada, the United States, and France. And we asked them to fill in a very simple questionnaire after every visit by a sales representative. And so we had almost 1,700 reports at the end. And we were looking at how often safety information was being provided. Our sort of primary outcome was a combination of, so it was a combination of what's needed safety information based on what physicians had said they needed for appropriate prescribing. So it was that they mentioned the approved use, at least one common side effect, at least one serious harmful effect if there was one, which there almost always is, at least one contraindication, and no unapproved indications. And you'll see, you can probably hardly see at the bottom the proportion in each city of how often that minimally adequate safety information was provided. It was less than 2% of the promotions. And this is an example of some of the statements. So we also asked the doctors to report, and these were primary care doctors, GPs, to report what the key message was. And in the promotions for Avandia, for instance, and this, we were collecting the data just before it ended up being restricted or taken off the market. So Avandia is safe even in patients with heart disease as long as they don't have heart failure. New studies indicate safety, safe in patients not in congestive heart failure. Avandia is safe. So these were spontaneously, what the doctors reported, and really, I think, shocking in terms of effect on patient care. The doctors also reported around 2/3 of the time they said they were somewhat or very likely to increase their prescribing after the sales visit compared with beforehand. And this was just something they filled in right after the visit itself. In general, from physician surveys or doctor surveys, the common view is, I'm not influenced, I'm just helping my patient. So essentially a feeling that they can, or I see all the sales reps from all the different companies, so I'm not affected. So there's a view generally that this is not important, despite the billions of dollars spent. Now, what about promotion to the public? So I did a little Google search on depression in Australia, and I got this website. It says depression, so it's by a physician, Dr. David Horgan. I looked all over the website, I could not find the funding source. So, and this, I'll just come back to what's in the corner later. So I looked on Crikey, where there is a register of influence in which physicians who act as key opinion leaders are listed. So it's an Australian registry, and he was there with a number of different links to companies. So it's basically physicians who've been involved in promotion for companies. What it says in the corner is a little tweet saying, a new antidepressant has just been released in Australia. Brintellix doesn't cause any withdrawal or sexual effects. 25% of people get some nausea. And then you'll see the other one is depression doctor. You can die from depression, but it can be treated right under it. And that gives you the impression that treatment can prevent those deaths. So you've just heard that that's certainly not the case. Now, Brintellix, or vortioxetine, was approved in Australia in 2014. I happen to have looked at the clinical trial literature on this drug. There were 12 clinical trials that were carried out, short-term ones, and 6 to 8 weeks long, of which the US FDA evaluated 10, and that's just because they approved it a little bit earlier. They judged 6 of these to be positive, 4 to be negative. What does negative mean? It means that the drug did not do better than placebo or sugar pill. Not even statistically significantly better, to a minor effect. 8 of the 12 short-term studies were published, and those in which vortioxetine or Brintellix did better mainly remain unpublished. So we saw a very big difference in the outcome between the published and the unpublished one. And 6 of them, and the difference was not large actually even in general. It's about 2 points on a 60-point depression symptom scale, the MADRS or the HAM-D scales. 6 of the studies compared vortioxetine to another antidepressant, and in fact it did worse by about the same amount as it did better than placebo in general. What did the FDA say? They say it is clear that each dose from 5 milligrams a day through 20 milligrams a day has demonstrated efficacy in at least one study. The underline is mine. European Medicines Agency, the efficacy of vortioxetine was demonstrated with at least one dosage group across 9 of the 12 studies. In other words, the others didn't show even a single dosage group, showing at least a 2-point difference to placebo, which arguably is too small a difference to be clinically meaningful. If you look at the published studies, there's a very strong company presence with more than 2 company employees, authors per published article. And all of the academic, so these are employees of the company themselves, and then the academic authors who are university professors like myself had significant financial ties, all of them. And what I mean by significant were key opinion leader type ties, either on advisory boards or speakers bureaus or both. And in over half of the published trials you get this statement that the manufacturer was involved in the study design, in the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data, in the writing of the report, and the decision to submit it for publication. Essentially, this isn't independent science at all. It's a level that should not be happening. And so what about this claim of no sexual or withdrawal effects? It's simply not true if you look at the product information that's approved in Australia or in the US or the European Union. They did find dose-related increase in sexual side effects, which are one of the more common side effects with antidepressants. But in most of the studies, they only asked one question of people when they came in for their clinical checkup: how do you feel? Now, most people are not going to volunteer information about sexual problems with that kind of a question. And that is a very well-recognized harmful effect of antidepressants. So they should have been at least asking about the well-known effects. And they also, yes, they did find withdrawal effects. The company itself could not make those claims. I don't know whether that tweet at the bottom of that website was funded, the person was funded by this company. I have no idea of that information, but certainly it's one real sort of problem in terms of physicians or doctors promoting to other doctors with financing from a company, or health professionals promoting to other health professionals, in that they are not bound by the regulatory standards the company itself is bound by. So that's why I'd say it's being swept under the rug, the adverse effects. Now, okay, you have a drug that's less effective than alternatives, no safer. How do you sell it? So this is from the US direct-to-consumer website on Brintellix, or it might have it has the same name in the US. You probably can't see it, but there are different colors from all those strands coming out of her head, and it's not a surprise this is her head, because women are prescribed many more antidepressants than men. You can link that to CME, so continuing medical education for doctors as well, same colors. Essentially, they're claiming that it affects a lot of different receptors, a lot of different types of serotonin receptors, and essentially, often you get these kinds of claims when you don't have clinical evidence of effectiveness, clinical evidence of a safety advantage. So just to say, yes, you can sell it. So what about overdiagnosis? I'm almost done. That's very quick. Ray Moynihan, who's a researcher out of Bond University, also a freelance journalist, looked at treatment guidelines for a set of, I think it was 15 common conditions in the US and international guidelines, and he looked at the conflicts of interest. The majority of the guidelines developers guideline authors had links to the manufacturers of drugs that were being discussed in those guidelines. And then he also looked at whether they expanded or they contracted the disease definition. The majority of them expanded the disease definition. There was only one where there was a question about possibly limiting it. And he and his colleagues found 3 different main ways they were doing it. So one is to create a new pre-disease. So you have pre-hypertension or pre-Alzheimer's disease.
Pre-psychosis syndrome.
Exactly. Pre-psychosis syndrome is exactly that as well, right? Where you're expanding, and of course, because most people are healthy, if you expand the disease to people who are less and less sick, you get a larger and larger number. You lower the treatment threshold, so something like high cholesterol, for instance, you just lower the number at which you start to treat. Or you have earlier diagnoses. So for things like rheumatoid arthritis, progressive disease, the point MS, heart attack as well, in terms of the measures that are actually used to call something myocardial infarction or heart attack. And this is also the this is just from an announcement for continuing medical education session for doctors. I would say there's also a lot of red herrings out there in terms of getting people to focus on the numbers, focus on getting to goal in terms of glucose, where what you want to do with diabetes is to keep a person out of hospital, you want to keep them feeling good and healthy, you want to prevent complications like amputations and heart attack. Whether that's with lower glucose or higher glucose, when you measure it, is beside the point. This you can't read, but so I'll read the questions for you because I think you'll probably need them. It's an adults ADHD screening test. So on the web, anytime you go, you can just Google any disease state and find a screening test and find that you have the condition, no matter what the condition is. I find I have them all. So this one, okay, how often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? And then the second question is, how often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? So I think a synonym for adult ADHD might be being human. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that every decision to use a medicine is a balancing act. It's a balance of taking into consideration the potential for harm against the potential for benefit. And when you are looking at a very serious condition that would, you're looking at things like HIV/AIDS, drugs that keep people alive who would be dying otherwise, of course your benefit-harm ratio is you're looking at much stronger weight to benefit. As you go milder and milder in terms of the condition, the likelihood of benefit becomes much smaller. And I should have fancy slides where I can twist this the other way. The likelihood for harm doesn't really shift. And that probably also comes out of Yola's presentation in talking about some of the expansion of the disease diagnoses. Anyway, that's it for me, so thank you very much.